Welcome to today's training on oppositional defiance disorder, or ODD. My name is Kelly Jackson, and I will be your presenter for today in going over the importance of understanding what ODD is, understanding what it is in your classroom, and strategies as educators and administrators for how to work with students who do display characteristics of oppositional defiance disorder. Okay, throughout this presentation, if you do have any questions or any epiphanies through the presentation, towards the end we can address those questions and those thoughts as a group, and hopefully by the time you leave this training you all have a kind of a better understanding of working with your students who may be displaying such characteristics as ODD. All right, so we're going to start with what we would think. Does this video clip define oppositional defiance disorders? As educators, we tend to come in the classrooms with biases about what we feel certain disabilities or certain behaviors should look like. And these biases, unfortunately, do impact the way in which we do instruct our students. So we're going to watch this video clip because this may be, with some of you as educators and administrators, identify as oppositional defiance. Excuse the slight technical difficulty, but it is loading. We can get this going.
First day?
Yes,
I'll take care of her.
thank you.
You know, kindergarten is like the ocean. You don't want to turn your back on it.
Okay. Don't worry. Everything is under control. No. Monsters. What are you doing with this?
Actually gonna break it out.
And we're going to stop it actually right there anyway. So I want you to take a minute to think about this concept of oppositional defiance disorder and break up the concept into defiance. After watching this video clip, in your mind, does this define what defiance stands for you? Okay, take a moment and think about that. Does what you just witnessed, does that define what defiance stands for you in your mind? Okay. Now, after taking a moment, of course, in the beginning, there was one of the characters made a wonderful comment saying, kindergarten is like an ocean. Never turn your back on it. And it's not just kindergarten, it's grades K through 12. You never know what your students are in the mood for, and it can be something tumultuous if you are not cognitive about what is going on in your classroom. So after thinking about what defiance means for you, after looking at these students who were clearly not listening to the teacher, who clearly were not following any rules, who were all over the place, does this define ODD? And the answer is no. Okay? Even though the students and the children that we watched in the video, they were kind of all over the place. And thinking about your own biases as an educator, that does not define oppositional defiance disorder, okay? That was just simply poor classroom management, okay? That's all that is. So when we look at the concept of oppositional defiance disorder, we're looking at however, it's easy for, we're looking at the fact, how do we define this? How do we define it as a mental health disorder? How do we define it as a disability? And thinking about that video, however, it is easy for educators to think that the actions they have witnessed in this clip are characteristics of students with ODD. It's imperative for educators to be properly trained in understanding what ODD truly is and how it will impact student learning. So when we think about students in our classroom, and we think about what kind of baggage they come in with, what kind of emotional load they come in with, what kind of environmental factors they're having to deal with. As educators, it's important that we really understand how can a student who has oppositional defiance disorder, how can this disability impact their ability to learn? Okay? So, the following slides are designed to help you as educators become more knowledgeable about oppositional defiance disorders in your classroom and how to best help your students and families. Being knowledgeable and prepared are the key ingredients to creating success in your classroom and helping your students create success within themselves. So this entire training is, how do I become knowledgeable as an educator, as a teacher, as an administrator in the specific understanding of the disability oppositional defiance disorder. Because many times we hear, that student doesn't listen, they're just bad. And that's not how we want to characterize our students. They're not just bad. They're not, it's not that they don't want to listen. We have to understand what is it that they're going through and what specifically does their disability, what role does that disability play in impacting their education. So by the end of this presentation, we're going to become as knowledgeable as we can with understanding oppositional defiance disorder. So what is ODD? Accordingly, oppositional defiance disorder is one of a group of behavioral disorders called disruptive behavior disorders. Key word is being disruptive, okay? ODD is one of the more common mental health disorders found in children and adolescents. Oppositional defiance disorder is a behavioral disorder that affects approximately 3.3% of the population across cultures, okay? So while it seems like it's a very little number of individuals who are impacted by ODD, what's important to understand is that it's impacted across cultures. It's not a white disease, it's not a black disease, it's not a Hispanic disease. Students from various backgrounds can suffer, adolescents from various backgrounds can suffer from ODD, okay? And it is a disruptive behavior disorder. So when we do have students in our classroom who display characteristics of ODD, it's important to understand they're going to display some characteristics of being disruptive, of finding ways to interrupt instruction for themselves, for you, and for those around them, okay? So how is ODD classified in special education? Oppositional defiance disorder is commonly classified under the special education category as an emotional disability, okay? Once a clinician has officially diagnosed a student with ODD, this student can fall under the classification of ED, emotional disorder, okay? We've also heard it being titled emotional behavior disorder, so it can be ED, EBD, okay, depending on what region you're in. but it can be classified under the ED category of special education. Students with ED will typically have behavioral intervention plans, BIPs, to help strategize ways to minimize or extinguish the unwanted behavior. So if your student who has ODD is constantly tapping and hitting another student, or is constantly putting their head down and refusing to do any work, you can develop a BIP. Under a series of steps, you can develop a BIP in order to help try to minimize this behavior, this unwanted behavior, and help the student become successful. Do you always need a BIP for a student with ODD? No. Okay. In some cases, however, students can also have their behaviors, unwanted behaviors as goals in their IEPs in order to specifically target that maladaptive behavior. Okay. So if you haven't gone through the process of a functional behavior assessment, which leads to a behavior intervention plan, then you can also consider the option of making the behavior a goal in the IEP. Okay, so Johnny will, keep his hands to himself 3 out of 4 observed trials measured quarterly in a school year. Okay, you can make it a goal, especially if it's something that is achievable within the duration of the IEP. Okay. So what are the patterns of individuals with ODD? They can be angry. They can have irritable mood. They come in. Those are your students that come in. I don't want to be here. Or they seem like they're upset. Those are ones that are going to have temper tantrums. Okay, as we were watching in that video, we see these kindergartners and we're like, oh yeah, they're having a temper tantrum and falling out. Or if you're thinking, I have a 3-year-old and my 3-year-old is falling out on the ground, they're having a temper tantrum, they might have ODD. That's not necessarily the case, but it has to be a pattern. There has to be some kind of consistency. They can be argumentative, okay, and defiant, aggressive without being, and aggressive in a sense to it not being necessarily a severe amount of aggression. Because once it becomes a severe amount of aggression, that's where we go from oppositional defiance disorder into something else we call conduct disorder. Okay, we're not going to be touching on conduct disorder in this training, but it's important to keep in mind that aggressive behavior can be seen not only in conduct disorder, but also in individuals who can be clinically diagnosed as having oppositional defiance disorder. Okay, but these are just patterns of what you will see out of individuals with ODD. So, do these patterns sound familiar of a lot of children? And the answer is yes. These patterns do sound familiar of a lot of children, okay? How many of us have seen children have tantrums? How many of us have seen children, put their head on their desk and not follow your directions, okay? It's very common, very, very common to see students who have moments of defiance. Keep in mind, all children from time to time will exhibit characteristics of being oppositionally defiant. However, the pattern, frequency, and manner in which the behavior is performed will separate a child who suffers from ODD versus a child who does not suffer from ODD. Just because your stubborn teenager doesn't want to follow your house rules doesn't mean that all of a sudden now they are having ODD, oppositional defiance. They're just not following your rules. But based upon the duration, the frequency, the pattern, that's when you can then begin to think, maybe I need to take my child in to be evaluated to see, do they suffer from something, and I need to put in interventions to help them, okay? Keep in mind, how can ODD be determined? I tried to highlight key elements for how ODD can be determined. The primary criteria upon which the clinicians determine whether or not a child is diagnosed with ODD is whether they have disruptive behaviors that are outside of their control, okay? If I'm sitting at work, and many of us as educators, if we're sitting at work and we don't feel like working, doesn't mean we're defiant. That's within our control. We're choosing not to work. We're choosing not to follow what we're supposed to do. But once it's outside of our control, let's say I'm not making the choice, I feel like it's something beyond me, then that's when we start to cross the line of maybe there might be some underlying factors that are affecting our work performance. And the same goes for the students in which we teach, okay? If the behavior is outside of their control, if you see a student sitting in your classroom and they're starting to display characteristics or behaviors that are uncommon for what you may know the student to act as, or the family is starting to raise questions, then that's where it's going to be very important for that family to go see a clinician. Not necessarily our role to advise families to go see doctors, but definitely, you know, being honest with our families and being honest with ourselves as educators and with our social workers and psychologists that work in our buildings. Definitely being honest with them about what we see is going to be very important. And the biggest thing is making sure that when we see a child displaying maladaptive behaviors, that it's not just mood or attention seeking. Because a lot of times we'll sit back as educators and think, oh, this child is not following my directions because they want attention. Okay? ODD is not an attention seeking mental health illness. Okay? It is definitely something that is within this child that they're unable to control and need maintenance. It's not that this cannot be worked on, but they need other interventions. Okay? ODD is characterized as manipulative and spiteful. Okay? It's not, today I felt like not doing my work. It's manipulative and spiteful. All right? And these start to go into the behaviors of what we might see in our classrooms, where now this manipulative and spiteful behavior is starting to impact this child's learning and potentially the learning of other students in the room. So, evidence-based strategies. One unique evidence-based strategy for working with students who have oppositional defiance disorder. And again, I tried to highlight so that way it doesn't seem overly wordy. Slow down. Teaching the student what we call problem-solving training. Teaching them to slow down, to stop and think, to recognize when they're having aroused or in an emotional state. Sometimes our students get so angry they do not realize the emotional state they are in. And this can be problematic, especially as they enter into adulthood. Okay? Staying in control. Pause for that sort of sound. Alright, so keeping in mind that when we're using this problem-solving training and we're teaching our students how to problem solve within themselves, we're teaching them to slow down. We're teaching them to stop and think, recognize, and stay in control. We're teaching them real-life strategies that they can use year after year in order to help them into adulthood to recognize and self-reflect and be self-aware of when they are aroused, when they are overly excited, and when they are starting to need to slow down and anticipate other alternatives for how they are feeling. Okay, so an evidence-based strategy being utilized currently is this concept of problem-solving training. Now, there are several other trainings that are out there, but this one seems to be very relevant to what it is we want to teach our students and what we want to instill within our populations about being aware of when they are frustrated, angry, and aggravated. Okay? So what are the signs of what we might see from an individual with ODD in our classrooms? Failure to follow directions, disruptive behaviors, disruptive to other students. Aggression, this could be verbal aggression. It can even be some physical aggression in there. You know, Johnny's pulling Susie's hair. And just a lack of care for others, okay? We see these ODD behaviors in many of our students, but the pattern and the consistency and the frequency for which they occur is what is very important for us as educators to understand with our populations and the students that we work with, okay? So the failure to follow directions, the, you know, just blah, blah, blurting out and you know, disrupting others, these can be very problematic because ODD not only affects that individual student, but it affects everyone in this child's social environment. Okay? So how does ODD impact learning? How does this relate back to the school setting? When students who are diagnosed with ODD are elevated, they will have a difficult time being receptive to processing information. Students may become unengaged, unmotivated, and lack the ability to want to try, which can impede foundational knowledge imperative for future learning. ODD behaviors can also impact the learning and security of the student's peers. Okay? So the key of how this is impacting learning is the ability to receive the information being taught within the classrooms and process that information. Okay? Many times we might see an individual who might have ODD also have a specific learning disability because their actual behavior is impeding their learning. Okay? So then as educators, we then have a dual role. How do I help this student manage their mental health diagnosis of ODD, and how do I help this student at where they are presently understand the material for which they are learning? Okay? Because what we don't want is for them to be completely unengaged, unmotivated, because we understand that as adults, as educators, what negative spiral, slippery slope can occur when individuals and adolescents and teenagers get ready to exit out of high school and they have displayed unengaging and unmotivated characteristics throughout their school years. And that is what we do not want, okay? So how do we teach students who display ODD? Simply 3 things. Be aware of possible triggers, okay? When students have behaviors, we must be cognitive of what might be a trigger. Be aware of escalation, okay? If you see that student is rubbing their hands, and every time they rub their hands on their desk, that's the sign they're getting ready to put their head down, we need to be mindful of that. And simply be aware of limits, okay? As adults, we all have limits. And our children and our students that we teach have limits as well. So when we're teaching individuals who display ODD, we need to be aware of their limits. And when they've reached those limits, we need to be flexible, open, and accepting. Okay, let's take a moment, let's take a break, and let's stop. And simply, we teach ODD students like we would teach any of the other students within our class. Okay, you're going to give them the same appropriate learning that they deserve, the education that they deserve, and we are going to eliminate our own biases when we are teaching these students. So, allow opportunities for breaks as needed. Build a positive and professional relationship with the student and their families. And I put keyword professional because we're not our students' friends. Okay, that's not what we come to work for. You don't have that student that's misbehaving and you say, you know what, I'm going to become your friend and that's how I'm going to get you to listen. That's not what we want. We want to make sure we're building professional relationships. Create a calm corner. Okay, this is effective for younger students and sometimes even for older students. Okay, develop teams who can support you and the student learner. Help the student become self-aware of their actions. Think about their peer relationships, okay? Because a lot of times when students display ODD, their peer relationships are highly impacted, okay? If Johnny is always pulling on Susie's hair, do you think Susie wants to be Johnny's friend? Probably not, okay? And everybody else who sees what Johnny is doing probably does not want to be friends with Johnny either. So we definitely have to reach and teach our students about appropriate behaviors and help them understand about becoming self-aware so it does not impact the relationships they want to have with others. Okay. So what does current research say about ODD? Research studies indicate that the number of African Americans diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder is disproportionately higher than other demographic groups. So what does this mean? This means the majority of the black students sitting in your classroom will 9 times out of 10 probably be diagnosed with ODD in comparison to their non-white peer, their non-black peers. This information suggests that a high number of minority students over non-minority students in the classroom will more likely be diagnosed with ODD. How does this information impact the dynamics of teaching and learning? Okay, when we're teaching in our urban populations, when we're teaching our minority students, and we receive information such as this, that ODD, the number of African Americans, minority individuals diagnosed with ODD is definitely disproportionately greater than our non-minority students. This is something that we have to process as educators for ourselves. Okay, why is it that our minority students are being disproportionately diagnosed with ODD in comparison to the non-minority students? So this is where we then have to think about those racial gaps, cultural gaps, and again, this concept of cultural proficiency, and trying to eliminate the biases, the racial biases and stigmas set forth on our minority individuals. That this information is very, very imperative for us to understand in helping our minority students get through these stereotypes and these diagnoses and these labels. As important as educators, we go forward with helping our students become successful no matter what their cultural background or their ethnic background is. Okay? So how does this information impact the dynamics of teaching and learning? As educators, it's important to understand the demographics of the population of students you work with. Okay? Take the time to implement calming strategies for students who display early signs of ODD or have already been diagnosed with ODD. Do not allow the information to impact your biases on the students you teach. Each student is different and each student is unique. ODD is a diagnosis, it is not the student. Okay, so if you walk into a majority African American classroom, your biases need to be put down. I don't want educators and administrators, it's important we teach our teachers. Don't walk in that classroom thinking, oh my gosh, all my students are going to be disruptive, they're not going to listen, they're not going to follow my instructions, they're going to be aggressive. No, every student is different and every student is unique, and that is exactly how we need to approach our teaching and our learning. So I will be sharing this slide with you all. I'm not going to show this video as of now, but as you watch this video, I want you to understand this video is going to show different examples of what is ODD, okay? You know, and students coming in and how they might exemplify those ODD characteristics, okay? So if you're looking for examples of ODD, how you might hear that in your classroom, this is a great video for watching in order to see what those examples might look like. So I like to use the analogy to try. When we're thinking about this concept of discipline, strategies, and reinforcers, when you're working with students with challenging behaviors, the biggest thing you have to do as an educator and as an administrator is try. Take the time to learn your students and show them you care. Practice patience. Relish on their small moments and reinforce their negative ones. Positive praise and immediate feedback is important, okay? And yield yourself to modify the needs of your students as well as the needs for yourself, okay? When you're working with students who may display characteristics as ODD or any emotional disability, yield yourself to be open to changing for yourself and to helping your students understand what it is that they, can work on to better themselves also, okay? Relish on their small moments. If Johnny comes in the classroom and doesn't put his head on the desk for the first time in a long time, you need to celebrate that. You need to take the time to say, you know what? And you don't have to say this in front of the whole class because sometimes students don't like that public embarrassment or the public accolades. But, take the time to tell John, I appreciate you coming in class today and not putting your head down. I appreciate you coming in class and keeping your hands to yourself. Relish on those small moments and let them know how much you appreciate when they are displaying what the appropriate behaviors are, okay? And make sure you just take the time to learn your students, okay? Don't come in with judgments. A lot of times we get stuck with, I've been teaching 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and we've already developed these predisposed biases about what students are and how they act and what this generation is about. Learn your students. Everybody is different. You are different, okay? But at the end of the day, take the time to try, okay? How can teachers and staff help students who display ODD? Be patient, be responsive, be proactive, remain calm, and offer alternatives, okay? When you're going back and taking this information to your staff, to your teachers, to your peers, remember, when working with students with ODD, be patient, be responsive, be proactive, remain calm. If you're heightened and they're heightened, it's not going to help the situation. Offer alternatives. Offer alternatives. Any questions? Any questions? If you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And this presentation will be posted, sent to email, so that way you all can receive this and take the time to go through it. If not, that concludes this presentation. Thank you.